Hello again all, Dr. JC here one more time for week or PowerPoint 8. In PowerPoint 8 here we're going to focus on medieval Europe, these Middle Ages in Europe, most specifically through this new social system that's going to emerge known as feudalism. So we're going to focus specifically on feudalism here as it relates to medieval Europe and talk about how it's going to help bring about the rise of modern nation states in Europe as well. When we're talking about medieval Europe or the Middle Ages, know that we're talking about roughly this time period from about the 5th century through the 15th century, or from the 400s to the 1400s, from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to this period known as the Renaissance or Age of Discovery, which we'll talk about at the end of the course. So before we get into feudalism, I thought it made a little bit of sense here to frame the time period. Again, we're talking about that time period from roughly the 400s to the 1400s. When considering how feudalism, this new social system that will emerge, fits into what's going on in Europe from 400 to say 1400s, I want you to think about the waxing and waning of power. Different individuals trying to bring larger areas and peoples under their control, like the Frankish Empire. And over time, these are going to do what? Rise and fall, wax and wane. One thing that will continuously increase in power, however, is that bishop in Rome, the Pope. The Catholic Church will continue to grow in power, and individuals throughout Europe, as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, are going to vie for power, vie for favor with the Pope to ultimately try to achieve that greatest of titles, which is Holy Roman Emperor. I want you to try to conceptualize in your mind's eye here, and perhaps you can use this pyramid that's on this slide to help visualize this, at least mentally, that this social system that emerges that we're going to call feudalism or the feudal system really does start with kings and queens. We have them. And beneath kings and queens then, lands are given to certain nobles. Titles are given to certain nobles by kings and queens in exchange for military service by those nobles. So the nobles then will provide the military service to the kings and the queens. The kings and the queens provide them with lands. You can see where this goes then, right? It's a mutually beneficial system for the elite at the top. Regarding everyone else, which was the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, it was broken down between what we might consider a middle class and then a lower class. While not truly a middle class as we'd think of one today, largely because in a middle class in present society, in most open societies like in the United States, there is a degree of social mobility, that an individual based on their own talents and hard work can rise in society. That's not the case here. Everyone has a place, everyone has a position in society. Thus, if you weren't from the elite, you weren't kings, queens, or nobles, you were part of this vassal class, as it were. Vassals being broken down into a couple larger segments, tenants and peasants. Tenants were just that. They were individuals that didn't have the name, the connections to be part of this nobility. Rather, what they did is they rented from nobles themselves, and they paid rent then to the nobles to work the nobles' lands. Peasants and serfs, however, these are individuals that wouldn't be very far removed from what we might consider slaves. These are individuals that had no family names that was recognizable in society, therefore no access to any titles and lands. In fact, they were required to work the lands of the nobles, give a percentage of the crops, their labor, homage as it was called, to the nobles, and in turn then the nobles would provide a degree of safety for them. This was all spelled out in an actual feudal contract that individuals entered into with one another, and we'll turn to that next. Prior to entering into discussion about these feudal contracts, however, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the feudal manor. Where did these peasants, where did these tenants work? Well, they're going to work on these great landed estates, these feudal manors. And these great estates are run by the nobles themselves. And in many ways, I want you to think of them as self-financed kingdoms. These lords and nobles were responsible for all aspects of administration, to include maintaining an army. Remember, they're given these lands and titles by the kings and queens in return for defense. Therefore, these individuals that own these feudal manors, Not only do they have to try to run a business here and make some coin for themselves, they have some pressures on them too to provide service to the king or the queen, and at the same token they're going to have the security of their peasants and or tenants that they have to be worried about as well. Thus, in a way, I guess we could say they're kind of like their own small towns or approaching medium cities. Sometimes you work in cooperation with one another or your neighbors. Other times you might together decide to go conquer another neighbor. So these are different estates, sometimes working together, oftentimes at odds with one another. And therefore you have this sort of kill or be killed environment that exists here, not just in a business sense, but in a literal sense. You could be overtaken at any time. Therefore, service to the estate or this feudal contract became that much more important. Thus, as depicted on this slide here, the landlord's responsibilities or the noble's responsibilities are going to be a lot more slim than that of the vassals, whether they be tenants or peasants. Rather than work through these obligations or responsibilities, you can read them here yourself. There are a couple of points, at least on the vassal side, that I kind of wanted to highlight here. Not only would vassals be required to perform military service for their landlord, they would also be required to work a specified amount of time every week in the landlord's fields as well. This was just a requirement. It was. The other point I wanted to highlight here is number 4, that landlords would approve all marriages of the vassals. So you didn't have to go to your daddy or someone's mama for approval for the marriage. You had to go to the landlord for approval of marriage. And you say, well, what's up with that? Well, this is the landlord's estate, and this is a matter of control and in some ways self-preservation. Hypothetical for everyone. You have someone, a vassal on your estate that comes and says, hey, I want to marry so-and-so, and they introduce so-and-so to you, and so-and-so you know to be a drunkard and a deadbeat. Is this someone you want to go ahead and have on your estate? You want a drunkard and a deadbeat working your lands, screwing up your crops? A drunkard or deadbeat in your army, helping defend and or attack for you? I don't think so. Therefore, the landlord was the ultimate individual to make the decision of yea or nay on all marriages. Before moving on to the importance of monasteries in this feudal system, this social system in medieval Europe, I wanted to talk briefly about this three-field system that most of these feudal manors or feudal estates, this is a type of system that they embraced. The three-field system was simply a crop rotation system. Because these folks didn't have the advantage of being able to call their fertilizer guy and say, hey, come in and spray a bunch of nitrogen on the ground, or phosphorus or potassium, NPK, all that stuff that makes your pumpkins grow huge, right, Charlie Brown? They didn't have that advantage. They didn't. Because these were pastoral peoples, farmers, herders, they recognized that there's something going on in the soil. If I keep planting the same thing there every year, the crops just don't come back right. I don't get the harvest I did before. Therefore, I need to rotate stuff around. As an example, if a landlord decided that his lands were going to be split up into 3 fairly large areas to plant for marketable crops, he would allow 2 of those 3 areas to be planted each year and 1 to go fallow. While a crude example here, I think it works. It would be kind of like the landlord saying, okay, look, we're going to put corn in one field, we're going to put beans in another, and by beans I mean soybeans, and in the field that we want to go fallow, we're going to put in a cover crop. Cover crop meaning alfalfa. Alfalfa that might be useful as fodder for one's livestock. And then, of course, at the end of the season, you could till that into the ground, which would help replenish the nutrients in the soil. Or you could even put a different form of cover crop in clover. Clover you could put in because that encourages honeybees. And because many of these guys would make their own mead, of which honey is a key component, beehives would be that much more important. Either way, that clover at the end of the season could be turned into the soil. You replenish the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium there, and then that field is ready for planting the next year. And what you would do the next year is rotate fields so that you always allow one field every 3 years to go fallow. This helped ensure that the soil would not be exhausted of its nutrients and that you could have a marketable produce every single year. Regarding marketable goods, the question is, where does one go to sell these things? Enter the importance of monasteries. They're going to have a dual importance. We'll talk about that right now. monasteries weren't just centers of religious faith and spiritualism. They were also economic centers, centers of commerce. Thus, they would have these market days, their festival-like days at the monastery, where surrounding estates would come. The individuals from those estates would come. They'd share their goods. They'd sell their wares. They'd interact with one another. All where? At an area centered around what? The Catholic Church. Thus, we have individuals that are engaging in a market society, a commercial society, at the same time still staying Catholic, Christ-centered. Dual importance for these monasteries. Can't understate the importance of them. Thus, it wed this idea for Europeans that, you know what, financial health and one's spiritual health, these can go hand in hand. It's okay. Really, it is. That I know that the good book says you can't serve two masters, right? Well, all things in moderation too. And therefore, economic prosperity and spiritual growth, those are okay things and they should go hand in hand. So it imbued Europeans, especially Western Europeans, with this idea of commerce and spirituality. And we're going to see that when we get into this age of discovery. As a way to start to wind down Part 3 and Lecture 8 or PowerPoint 8 in its entirety, I wanted to zoom out, so to speak, from the monastery, still focus on commerce, but look at it in a little bit more larger global sense. Not just mediums of exchange in the form of currency, but where are we trading these goods, especially outside of Europe? Trade itself was conducted all throughout Europe and beyond, to include into the Muslim world. Look, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're Christian or Muslim. If you're a business person, you're in this game to make some jack, right? So, religious differences aside, if I've got an opportunity to sell some goods to an individual, I'm probably going to take advantage of that. Therefore, Christian and Muslim traders or merchants, they're not going to have a problem sharing goods with one another, selling goods with one another. They're not, even despite their religious differences. No different then as today. Because silver was so prevalent as a hard currency or medium of exchange in the Near Eastern or Middle Eastern world, it became attractive for use in European society as well, whether it be silver or to some extent gold. Hence the silver and gold here. So our hygienists that are in the crowd, Hermes in the house. Make sure you're paying attention to your choppers. Floss nightly, folks. Take care of them choppers. Yeah, baby. Joking aside, other than the flossing, that's not a joke. That's the real McCoy. Make sure you're flossing, for sure. The point here is that through this exchange with the Near Eastern and Middle Eastern world, the Muslim world, silver and gold will slowly become the standard, the base bullions or alloys that are going to measure one's wealth in Western Europe. And that's going to be important down the pike. We'll talk about that later. The other aspect as it relates to trade to the Near Eastern world and this re-emergence of Western Europe or the Western Roman Empire is that much of this trade can be conducted through the Mediterranean Sea, which means that folks in Western Europe, you don't have to go through Byzantium or the Eastern Christian Church to get to the Near Eastern world. You can just sail there. Therefore, profits don't need to go through the Byzantine lands. They can come directly to you. Important point. As a way to summarize feudalism then, and before we turn next to moving to the continent of Africa and the great civilizations there, we'll talk about gold. We're going to go to the land of gold next when we talk about Africa. I wanted to summarize quickly here some of the key salient points as it related to medieval Europe and feudalism. The Middle Ages or medieval Europe again was roughly the 400s to 1400s, or roughly the collapse of the Western Roman Empire until this rebirth of Europe known as the Renaissance in the 1400s, and we'll talk about that later. The salient element of this Middle Ages was this feudal system. Feudal order. Kings, queens give titles to lands to nobles. Nobles have vassals working on these feudal estates or manors for them. The feudal manors were these large self-financed kingdoms, huge entrepreneurial endeavors, sometimes at odds with one another, sometimes working in concert with one another, always meeting in the middle at the monastery here to exchange goods and reinforce the importance of the Catholic Church. And it'll be the combined weight of this Catholic Church and commerce that's going to help Western Europe emerge as a dominant global player. Dr. JC out from Lecture 3 in PowerPoint 8.